Welcome back, Principal Matters podcast listeners. So excited for episode 502. I am Dr. Jen Schwanke, and I'm here with my friend and co-host, William D. Parker. Hi, Will.
Oh my gosh, Jen, just hearing you say 502, I'm like, what? It's just so crazy to me that we've passed 500. And, I've said this before. If anybody listened to the celebration episode, you've heard me brag on Jen. But I have so much fun listening to your interviews, and I can't wait for listeners today to hear your interview with Erica. But before we do that, we have a question of the week. And here's this. This is a peculiar one. This leader says, I have said yes to a new position within the district. How do I leave my current school in the best way possible while also doing my best to get ready for that upcoming role? There's a lot packed into that question. And you've been there, Jen, and so have I. So what are some things we would say in 5 minutes to this listener?
I was just last week talking to a principal who's moving to a different role, and he was standing on the soccer field watching kids play soccer and not fight. That was his goal. And he said this exact question to me. Yep. My answer was this: don't overthink it. Do not overthink it. Your new job, you'll get busy enough with that soon, very soon. The job you're leaving, there are probably some feelings of being a little bit of a lame duck, and maybe not needing to pay as much attention to certain things, and that's okay. Truly, my big advice is don't overthink. Go to work, do your best work there, but don't look too far ahead and think you need to make a big fat splash on for your new situation. You will have plenty of time for that. So maybe just relax and enjoy the last few days in your current role would be my perspective.
Jen, this is why we make such a great team, because I'm going to speak to the worrywart. I'm going to say, for those of you that can't chill, even though Jen told you to, I do agree with you, Jen, that make the most of the last few days you've got and make sure you connect with people, love on people, let them know that you care about them, and that new job will be waiting for you. But if you can't stop your mind from racing, then I have a suggestion of something that's helped me, and I call it an exit plan and an entry plan. When I left my last position, I had 2 different Google Docs that I kept. And every time something popped into my head about, I need to do this before I leave, I would put it on that document. And every time something popped in my head of, I got to do this when I get to the new position, I put it on that document. And I just kind of kept the running brain dump of the 2 places, so it didn't drive me crazy. And guess what? Eventually I got to all the things on those lists. Mm-hmm. So if that's helpful, then, do a brain dump. If you can keep it all in your head, I can't. If you keep it all in your head, good luck. Anything else you want to add to that question, Jen?
I had a friend who solved this with a pad of blue sticky notes and a pad of pink sticky notes. And one was one school and one was the other. And she just all day long, she would log her thoughts. So whatever works for you, but don't rush, don't rush away from your current situation. You'll want them, you're building your legacy right now, right? So you want them to say, oh, that was a great last few months with so-and-so.
Yeah. That's what I'm going to add one other thought, Jen, and I know that we may go a little long, but I'm curious how this worked for you. I think one of the regrets I had the last time I transitioned from school to director, before I started this work full time, I probably didn't take enough time to say goodbyes because I didn't want to overwhelm people. I didn't want to make a big deal about it, but there was a part of me that regretted not spending a little more time just touching base and letting people know how much you cared about them. How was that for you?
Yeah, I feel I'm terrible at goodbyes. Terrible. Absolutely terrible. So I don't like them. I want to avoid them. And so I've not done well with that. But I also am acutely aware that one of the realities of leaving a job is usually wherever you are, they move on pretty quickly. They'll miss you.
Yeah.
But they don't want a party and then a gathering and then a breakfast and then the cards and then the book. Like, it's okay to move on. Mm-hmm. And so I think just so you're feeling healthy and you're the school that you're leaving feeling healthy, it's okay to go guilt-free. And just don't be bad like I am. And I prefer an Irish exit anytime. Just peace out.
Out the door. Get up on the weekend. Don't say anything. There's a lot of ways. This is such an interesting conversation, but we're going to transition now to the guest that you're interviewing, Dr. Erica Buchanan-Rivera. And Jen, how can our listeners stay connected with you as they wrap up a semester and step into summer?
Yep. Find me at jenschwanke.com. Reach out and I maybe can offer some help. Or you can subscribe to my newsletter at jenschwanke.com.
And you can find today's show notes and all of the other resources available for Principal Matters listeners at williamdparker.com. Until next time, thanks for doing what matters. Let's take a moment to thank our sponsors, and then we'll be right back. Everyone talks about the power of data-driven instruction, but what does that actually look like? Look no further than iExcel, the ultimate online learning and teaching platform for K-12. iExcel gives you meaningful insights that drive real progress, and research can prove it. Studies in nearly all 50 states across the U.S. show that schools that use iExcel outperform other schools on state tests. Educators who use iExcel love that they can easily see how their schools are performing in real time to make better instructional decisions. And iExcel doesn't stop at just data. iExcel also brings an entire ecosystem of resources for your teachers with a complete curriculum, personalized learning plans, and so much more. It's no wonder that iExcel is used in 95 of the top 100 school districts. Ready to join them? Visit iexcel.com/PM to get started.
You're listening to Principal Matters, the School Leaders Podcast.
Welcome back, everyone, to Principal Matters Podcast, dedicated to transforming school leadership into life-changing impact. I'm your host, Dr. Jen Schwanke, and today we're diving deep into the core of leadership, identity-affirming culture, and the crucial balance between empathy and accountability. And I have a wonderful guest today, a respected voice in education, Dr. Erica Buchanan-Rivera, also known as Dr. EBR. She is a former award-winning principal, a director of curriculum, and a chief equity officer. She is the author of Identity Affirming Classrooms, Spaces That Center Humanity. Her work empowers leaders to be the educator they needed as a child. So here is a unique starting point for our conversation today. I recently had the honor of speaking to Dr. EBR's graduate class at DePaul University, and it was a class of students, both future and current school leaders. They asked me a series of powerful and reflective questions about my own practice. And the questions were so fun that I thought they deserved to be answered by Dr. EBR herself. So, Dr. EBR, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
There's a lot we want to talk about today. You have quite a body of work, and I want to dig into it. So let's start with that. Tell us about yourself and tell us about your work.
Sure. I was born and raised in Peoria, Illinois, and relocated to Indianapolis, Indiana when I started my collegiate level experience at Butler University. My family would probably share that I have always been justice minded. I was the upstander within school. I joined many advocacy groups in high school as well as college, and have always felt compelled to speak truth. So currently, I am working at DePaul University after years of educational leadership, and I still carry that disposition of speaking truth, speaking out in the face of injustice as I work with aspiring school leaders. I help aspiring leaders to learn about equity centered practices and humanizing approaches in leadership. It's important for leaders to think about conditions for learning and to eliminate the factors that hinder achievement as well as positive school experiences for youth. And this work has always been inspired by my school experiences. I attended a predominantly white school as a child within Peoria, Illinois, where I did not see myself reflected within curriculum, within teachers, within leadership. And although teachers had good intentions to be culture responsive, we know that good intentions alone do not yield to an inclusive environment. So, schools where I learned about racism, dehumanizing language, microaggressions. And during that time, I also gained an entry point into Justice Center work as I started to cultivate and strengthen my voice as an advocate. And so I see myself currently as the leader that I needed in school spaces. And that is the work I am trying to perpetuate at a collegiate level while working with aspiring leaders, helping them to be courageous within spaces and to stand out against injustice as well as dehumanizing and malpractices.
What a beautiful barometer to have for all of our listeners to think, is this what I would have needed? Is this what was it that may have been missing in my own experience that I can now provide? Like, I just love that as kind of an ongoing metric. And in your book, you shared, and in your work today, you share moments of challenge that helped you and therefore a future leader recognize that mistakes happen too. And so talk to us about your reflection strategy as you work and where things have really gone right using a reflection strategy and maybe where it may have gone wrong.
Sure. I will do a little bit of framing initially. Within my book, I talk heavily about the concept of mirror work, which is an introspective process that encourages us as leaders to reflect on the shaping of our leadership identities, including the beliefs that influence our interactions, our decision making, as well as our practices. With ongoing self reflections, we are able to center our own humanity within our practices. And without self awareness, we are pulled further away from our humanity. In other words, we do not demonstrate the ability to self assess our emotions, thoughts, and decisions. If we are in positions where we are not critically thinking about the shaping of our human condition. As for my own personal journey, I do not think it took a long time, I will say, to adopt mirror work practices into my leadership. For as long as I can remember, I was always an analytical, reflective person. I was that child and adolescent, even adult now, who would go back into my quiet space, replaying conversations, thinking about what I could have said differently or what I could have done. And so I do not feel like things have changed in that regard. But if anything, as a leader, I have become more intentional with those practices.
That makes so much sense to me because remember, you opened with the idea of what you needed, which means
Mhm,
you've always had that mirror up. It's a
mhm.
metaphor for how you frame who you were and who you are and who you're going to be. So I interrupted, so please
Yeah,
finish your thought.
no, I just think about how for all of us, as leaders, our priorities have shifted, over the years. And with so many demands, it is really hard to get in a place where we are able to center ourselves and self reflect. And I just think about those days where I have come home from work and I have felt weary, frustrated, or exhausted in various leadership contexts. And when we return home and into our safe spaces, the last thing we want to do is interrogate ourselves. We want to reach, in our fridge and grab our comfort foods, binge watch our favorite shows, or in my case, put on our additional hats, my mom hat, my hat as a wife, and attend to a multitude of responsibilities that are tied to those roles as well. And so it's very hard to just sit down and reflect on whether or not we have been a good human for the day, or what do we need to be a better human tomorrow. And so I have to spend an intentional amount of time thinking about those questions before I lay my head down at night and think about the type of leader I want to be and how I want to show up for others. And I will say that although it may not be consistent some days, depending on the flow of the day and what happens, I can say confidently that it is a practice that I adopt that certainly influences my leadership.
I'm glad that you admitted that there are some days it's hard to do that, like, especially as a
It
mom,
is.
there's days I mean, I have had the thought before, "Who has time to reflect? Are you serious? I gotta get home, I gotta get this house clean, I gotta get the meal made, I gotta
We have
get"
recitals to get to, yes.
There's a lot going on. What's so fun about you as a guest and a professional is you've had roles, it sounds like, from kindergarten teacher up to chief equity officer in the
Yes,
district.
yes.
So, knowing that our audience is principals or aspiring principals, a lot of assistant principals too, what has been your most memorable or maybe defining moment as a principal that shaped your approach to leadership and equity today?
I started my journey into the principalship quite early, to be frank with you and fully transparent. I was in my early years of teaching, probably less than 5, when I had a superintendent approach me and say that they wanted me to think about being an assistant principal within an international magnet school. And at that time, of course, I thought, I need more years of experience. I'm too young. I love the work that I'm doing with kids. I don't want to leave the classroom. And yet, when your work is noticed by district leaders, you are making the mark in terms of achievement and it is well noticed within your data. You have leaders who will tap you on the shoulders, who want you to expand your practices to larger contexts. And so I accepted the nudge. I tell people it was against my will, but I accepted the nudge and landed my first assistant principal role. And there were a lot of things that I noticed during that time, particularly related to racial inequities and disciplinary procedures. Going through the school and conducting walkthroughs, I noticed that there were many Black males who were left unsupervised in the hallways as their desks were pushed outside of the classroom as a disciplinary consequence. And there were things that I wanted to change immediately.
Right.
And as a principal, I always thought if I were in this seat, I would also think about culture responsive teaching practices and more systems based approaches to address these inequities. And little did I know that would happen the following year as I had another superintendent nudge me and say, hey, we're going to shake things up within the district. We're going to move principals around. I think it's time. You're doing great work here as an AP. We want to see you soar as a leader. And I'm sharing this context because I'm going somewhere with it. And so it was announced I was going to be a school principal. And I vividly remember my principal standing next to me, as an AP, as this announcement is being made.
Yeah.
And she says in front of everyone, Erica received the job. We are so happy for her. We know she will do a wonderful job. And she was not my first choice. I would have went with someone who had more years of experience. And
Ouch,
so I'm
Eric.
sitting there. Oh, yes, it was the ultimate ouch. And so I'm sitting there processing this and I'm thinking, wow, talk about a setup for failure. So I get into that role, already just feeling a lot of doubts. But I also am entering this school being very pro kid minded and thinking about all the things that need to change, particularly practices to support multilingual learners. We were a C rated school at that time because we had changed boundaries. And so overnight, it seemed like our predominantly white blue ribbon school shifted. And we had high populations of Black and Brown children, Spanish speaking students. And there were shifts that needed to change, pedagogically within our schools. So I work closely with teachers to help engage them in mirror work practices to truly hone in and think about their beliefs about children and how we can best show up for students, to think about our practices being culturally responsive to the needs of students, making sure that we had high interest texts. And there were so many strategies that I poured into teachers. And I will say that there was a lot of resistance because when you become accustomed to doing things a certain way for the last 15 years with a different leader, to have another leader who comes in half your age and tells you, hey, we've got to change some things.
And you were a
You're going
woman.
to have pushback inevitably.
Right.
And so,
Yep.
and I will say that a majority of the staff were ready for those changes. So there's that. And over time, with a lot of the shifts that we were making, we noticed changes in student achievement and data within the climate and culture of the school. And at the end of the year, progress was raised to a point where that school letter grade shifted from a C to an A, which I maintained for the duration of my principalship. And so that was my proudest moment, knowing that I had the ability to transform systems in practices that were rooted in culture responsive teaching, anti bias, as well as anti racist pedagogy.
Well, and that's like moving the Titanic. That is a big, big job. And really what I'm hearing you say is you change the systems and thereby we're able to change the culture too. And a lot of
Correct.
principals, I think, struggle with that. They think they have to do one and then the other. I'll improve culture and then I'll think about systems. But I think you literally waste years and you might not harm children individually, but you may contribute to the harm that might be happening. And so here's a question for you. When you were implementing and when you still implement new systems or initiatives, how do you ensure that staff buy-in is genuine and they're not just merely you know, complying? And the reason I ask, you mentioned some teachers, maybe they'd been doing it one way 15 years. Erica, it could be 30. It could be that they've
Oh,
always done
sure.
this. And so they
Absolutely.
might think, here comes this lady and she's telling me to do something differently. Fine, I will when she's in in proximity, but then I'm going back to what I like, right? So how do you ensure that genuine buy-in, especially when the work is challenging and feels uncomfortable?
I will say that you answered this question beautifully, by the way, within my course. And I would echo some of the sentiments that you shared first, and just being very clear and frank and transparent. You have to accept the fact that you may not have the buy in from all members of a school community. You have to live with that.
Mhm.
In an ideal world, it would be perfect if everyone aligned with your initiatives as a leader, but that is not possible when you are working in diverse communities of people who have different lived experiences, cultural identities, and belief systems. And I also believe that resistance does not have to communicate or signal defiance. It could signal that more information is needed, that more context is needed within our decision making. And so when there is resistance, I tend to listen and I want to know, what are some of the barriers, what may be hindering people from getting on board. I think having a human dialogue is key in those situations and making sure that you are gaining insight into people's perspectives, that you are creating space for voice where people can raise their concerns and you can troubleshoot things proactively. That helps with buy in, in my opinion. And I think we have to spend time engaging in, learning opportunities with staff with the belief that we may not know what we don't know as well as leaders.
Here's why I love what you just said. I think that I do a presentation to new principals every year, and I say to the in our state association, and I tell them some things they're going to hear. One of them is, "Well, we've never done it that way before. We've always done it this other way," and I say that feels like a barrier, but you have to hear what they're really saying, which is, "I'm scared."
Sure.
I need you to hear me and explain more. And so I love that your approach there is tell me more. What is it that
Right.
is making you feel that this isn't going to work?
Right. It's not always the personal attack you may make it out to be.
Right. Right. So tell me about, you've mentioned several times this idea of inclusivity in schools and culturally responsive teaching and culturally responsive leadership. So talk to us about maybe some non-negotiable indicators that principals can look for in their daily practice to gauge, are we really being inclusive? Do we really have a sense of belonging? What can our principals who are listening right now as they commute to work, what might they look for?
Within my research, to provide more context, I completed a factorial analysis to determine components that generate an inclusive environment. It was a quantitative study. Yet I'm very clear within my research and when I go out and consult within the world that those components must be coupled with a knowledge base of anti bias as well as anti racist education and the will to practice just actions. It's not about what you design within a classroom or construct. It's about your disposition that is coupled with the classroom design, the pedagogy, and things that we embraced as educators to create inclusive spaces for youth. Yet, one of the look fors that I generally consider as I'm in schools is evidence of student learning. It is affirming to witness the gifts and contributions of students. And so I go into classroom spaces and I try to understand what is the story of learning here and what information does this provide me in terms of the identities of students as learners. And it leads to great entry points with students when you are going into classrooms and you're able to see that evidence and you can engage students into a conversation to understand the things that they are engaging in, practicing, what they're wondering about as students, as learners. And so I do look for evidence of learning because, again, it's affirming to witness the gifts and the talents of our students. And I also look for evidence of school community partnerships. And that could be external partnerships, with community businesses, local agencies, with service-based organizations. It could be the school family partnership. I look to see evidence of that as well. There are schools that have great displays of those partnerships evident within entryways. There are teachers who have areas designated where students can share more about their family, their cultural identity, and those origins. Yet again, I'm very clear that those look fors in isolation mean nothing without the deep work of interrogating ourselves, recognizing our approaches as anti-bias, anti-racist leaders. So it's a both and something that I talk about heavily within identity affirming classrooms.
You guys, I'm recording this podcast in my son's bedroom and I need a pen because I need to write down things I need to say right now. First of all, I want to tell you, I used to teach a graduate class and it was called School Community Partnerships. And it was so complex, though, that word. And so I thought I'm going to teach internal partnerships first, and then I'm going to teach external the second 7 weeks. And then I was like, well, I can't do that. I can't split them because it's all so interconnected, right? And that idea of being a leader and inclusivity, when you first started talking, I thought about how many times I've thought I don't have bias, I don't have my mind made up about certain
Right.
children and their skin color or where they live or where they came from, the background. And then I started listening to myself, and I listened to other people, and some of the things we say unconsciously will reveal all kinds of stuff. And so I love that you have a tool for that. But even more impactful than that tool is that awareness. And you have such a presence, Erica. You're not saying any of this in any way where I'm feeling threatened or accused. And so I imagine as a leader, you had many staff members who didn't feel that threat. It's almost an invitation, right, to be empathetic and accountable to ourselves. So that's going to lead me to my next question, which is what advice do you give to your students, emerging principals, aspiring principals who want to lead with that empathy and accountability without swinging too far in either direction? And how do you ensure that accountability doesn't diminish humanity?
Mhm. That's a great question. As a leader who focuses on humanizing approaches, I
Mhm.
think heavily about our human condition.
Right.
And I view accountability as an act of love and as an act of care. As a principal or a district administrator, now professor, I often tell those who I am working with and supervising that I am here to help you to become a better version of yourself. I am bringing things to your attention that need to be addressed. And it's not coming from a place of harm, but rather from a place of care. I want you to grow professionally, and I want students to have a positive experience. They deserve that. Therefore, through that framing, accountability is centering humanity. I'm thinking about your personhood. I'm thinking about your growth. I'm thinking about how to help you become this person who you're proud of, who others are proud to be around. I'm helping you to think about your human interactions. So I see accountability as a means of centering our humanity, not diminishing it.
I as you said that, I kind of got a shiver because I think some of my most proud moments as a professional have been when I had the courage to hold myself accountable, not only for my words, but my thoughts. And I felt proud after because that's hard work to do. And you think, wow, I grew a little bit today. I'm going to think about things differently or talk about them differently. Um, so thank you for that. And listeners, if you're like, what did she just say? Go back about 60 seconds. Listen to that. Um, one of your graduate students asked me when I was in your class about how to kind of navigate a tricky conversation about their purpose and their priorities and their patterns with an administrator who's kind of resistant to that and says, just teach, you're here to teach math, just teach math. So, based on your work in curriculum and administration and teaching and research, what is the best entry point for that crucial dialogue for teachers and administrators?
I will just say critical conversations is a hard skill and topic to teach as well as talk about because it's messy human work. And this is a challenging question because we're talking about human interactions and responses that we cannot necessarily control. I always advise for students as well as teachers to advocate for their needs. If you want to grow professionally, if you feel like things within a system are hindering your ability to perform or your ability to be your best self, then it's important to lead with transparency. So, for instance, in that scenario, as I have shared with that particular teacher and others who have been in very similar situations, it's important for teachers to express how their priorities revolve around teaching and learning, yet they may see a bigger purpose for their life as a professional and want to explore those options or various pathways for leadership opportunities. If you work with a leader who values that purpose, they will create room for shared leadership and they will help you to grow as a professional. If you work with a leader who does not see your value, who diminishes you despite a critical conversation, then you may have to engage in the mirror work, that introspective work, and have that conversation with yourself, determining are you in the right place? And
Mhm.
I know you have had that conversation before, as you shared with my students. I have had that conversation before with myself. And in some cases, I have wrestled with thoughts until I finally came to the conclusion I'm not in the right space and I need to think about my next step.
Right. Right.
Yet you have
Yeah.
to have the conversation first.
You do. You have to have the conversation and then you have to have the internal conversation. And, I
Yes.
do a lot of work with having difficult conversations. And what's so interesting is sometimes I'll be working with a group. Somebody will have, paid me money to go into a room and have this training. And I will be able to pick out who's going to be able to do this because some people just aren't ready and they're not going to be ready. They can't say hard things, nor can they hear hard things. And that's, um, you know, as you said, I don't know your exact words, accountability is a form of love. It is a form of caring. Wow, what an important concept. And I want everybody listening to think about that. When you hold people accountable, it's not like you're some parent, punishing a kid for not picking up his wet towels. It's much more than that. And so Erica, that's going to lead us to our last and maybe most thought-provoking question.
Uh,
Um, your doctoral research centered on cultivating this inclusive school environment. And given your focus on truth decay and political violence, oh my gosh, we should talk a lot about that. How can principals effectively create
so
these
much.
identity affirming spaces that do protect students' authenticity while navigating this increasingly polarized social and political landscape? Big question. Big, big, big.
It is a big question. And it's very unfortunate to see what has unfolded within the last few months within schools. where people feel as if they are not able to speak courageously in promotion of diversity, equity, or inclusionary work. And my push for leaders, which is what drove me to academia, specifically in educational leadership at this time in the moment of our history, is to help leaders practice courageousness. It's so important, especially now, for us to walk in our values that pertain to justice. And yes, it may look differently in terms of how we implement things, in terms of how we have conversations, but the work still lives within our systems. And I have to remind people, we also have to tap into the wisdom of our ancestors. I talk heavily within my courses about ancestral leadership and encourage for students to develop their ancestral leadership playbooks. Because when we think about those before us, various racialized communities advocating for change, white abolitionist communities working in partnership and in solidarity with historically marginalized and minoritized communities, they weren't using DEI acronyms and all of this language that we've become accustomed to within schools. They were out there doing the work. There were grassroots movements, they were engaging with their communities, they were on the grounds having conversations. And it wasn't, this structured approach that, we have operationalized within schools. And so I think we need to go back to some of those roots and find ways to help make inclusionary work live within our systems without having to always operationalize it. And that can be done. And that's actually something that here's a plug for the next book, I am going to be talking about in my next book, which focuses on DEI practitioners. It's going to be a handbook, in fact, for DEI
Nice.
practitioners, looking
Nice.
specifically at this moment of our history and how we move forward.
Nice. So for our listeners, I would encourage you to go back and hear some of what Erica just said. And here's why. Erica, you are my favorite type of guest because my head hurts a little bit right now. The way you use language, you just use the word minoritized. I don't hear that very often. And I learned this important phrase through Dr. Muhammad Khalifa, who was a doctoral professor. He wrote the book Culturally Responsive Leadership. He
No,
used that word and he explained why he used that word rather than minority. And I've used minoritized ever since. And I think even that, just a critical change in what we mean when we say that word is important. So you guys look that up. And Erica, I've had to think very, very deeply. So that's my highest compliment to you, that every single word that you're using is thoughtful and intentional. And I'm so grateful to you for sharing your insights, but also taking on these reflection questions of leaders. It's so clear to me that building an identity affirming classroom starts with an identity affirming principle. And so
yes.
thank you for the strategies you shared today, from ensuring that genuine buy-in to adopting that empathy and accountability. So for everyone tuning in, I do encourage you to check out Dr. EBR's book, Identity Affirming Classrooms, and explore her work online as well. The power really is in the community. So Dr. EBR, where can they find you and your work?
I am on LinkedIn. I have had to make a lot of shifts when it comes to social media over the last few months, with platforms becoming more dehumanizing and one sided in terms of political affiliations. And so I have dabbled a little bit into threads, into Blue Sky, but ultimately, LinkedIn would probably be the best place to
Yep.
engage and find me.
Go to LinkedIn, but also your website's fantastic, right? Do you stand?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So tell us about your website, because that's where you and I had this great conversation with your students, and then I looked at your website and I'm like, wow, there's a body of work. So what's your website?
drbuchanan-rivera.com. And there is certainly a place where you can, contact me. I will engage. I typically email people back. I also consult. And so if there is support needed within a school to, think more about justice-centered work, I'm happy to be a critical thought partner as I want us all to win within our field. And you'll also be able to see, as Jen laid out, my body of work. There are plenty of things I'm sure I need to update, but you'll be able to see a lot of articles, various podcasts where I am talking about just the importance of, humanizing ourselves, showing up for youth, and making sure that we are prioritizing systems where students are able to thrive and have their needs met. And that is through the work of actively removing barriers and identity threats that may cause students harm.
Perfect. Beautiful. Thank you. And I will put the link to your website in the show notes for today's episode. You'll find that at williamdparker.com, and reach out to Erica, if nothing else, just to talk to her. I'm sure that one-on-one coaching would be very powerful as well if you just need someone to talk you through this. So reach out to her, reach out to me. If you have questions, I can put you in contact with Dr. EBR. And thank you so much for your time, Erica. It's been just fabulous.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to connect once again.
No problem. No problem. And listeners, join us next time on Principal Matters. We're going to keep talking about leadership from all these important voices. So until then, keep doing what matters.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Principal Matters, the School Leaders Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, would you take a moment and like, share, subscribe, or leave us a review? In fact, if you share it out with a friend, even more people can become a part of these conversations. Sign up for our newsletter at williamdparker.com for even more free resources. And don't forget to check out our website to learn more about our books, professional development offerings, Grow Academies, masterminds, executive coaching, and keynote presentations. Wow, let's keep learning together. And thank you for doing what matters.
Principal Matters.